Hey guys, tonight we begin with the dark, terrifying, and genuinely misunderstood world of Night Before Electricity. Not the romantic candle and fireplace version. The real one. Where darkness meant crime, superstition, and a fire risk that could take an entire city down by morning. If you enjoy sleeping through the parts of history they forgot to light up, hit like and subscribe, because we are about to spend the night somewhere you would not want to be. You think you know darkness, you do not. The darkness you know, the darkness of a bedroom with the curtains closed, or a country road at 2 in the morning, still contains light. There is the glow of the phone on your nightstand. There is the bleed from the streetlight outside. There is the specific blue-orange tint of a sky that has absorbed an entire civilization's worth of artificial light and is slowly releasing it back at you. Even the darkest night you have personally experienced was lit by the standards of most of human history, to a degree that would have seemed miraculous and slightly implausible. Pre-electric night was different in a way that is now almost impossible to experience directly unless you are inside a cave, underground, at midnight with the lights off. Total darkness. The kind where you cannot see your hand in front of your face. Not metaphorically. Actually, the kind where the darkness is a physical presence rather than just an absence of light. Where your eyes, fully dark, adapted, are still not seeing anything meaningful, and your brain begins to work with what it has, which is nothing, plus whatever you believe is in there with you. For most of human history, most people, most of the time, spent a significant portion of every night in this kind of darkness, and they had many considered opinions about what was in it. The primary artificial light source available to ordinary people for most of recorded history was fire. Fire in the hearth, fire in the oil lamp, fire in the tallow candle. Fire, in one form or another, was what stood between you and the absolute dark. And fire, as a light source, is considerably less impressive than its central role in human civilization might suggest. A single tallow candle, the standard household lighting technology of medieval and early modern Europe, made from rendered animal fat, smelling of cooked meat and burning incompletely, producing a flame roughly equivalent to a modern 7-watt bulb, provided enough light to see the objects immediately around it, and essentially no light to anything more than a few feet away. You could read by a candle if the candle was close to the page and the text was large. You could not illuminate a room with a candle. You could create a small island of visibility in the middle of a large body of darkness, and you could do this while generating smoke, smell, and a constant risk of fire that was treated with the resigned seriousness of a known and accepted hazard. The cost of candles was not trivial. Tallow candles, the cheaper kind, made from beef or mutton fat, were affordable for ordinary households in moderate quantities, but burning multiple candles simultaneously for multiple hours each evening was a meaningful household expense. Beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and smelled better and produced slightly more light, were significantly more expensive and were largely the province of churches, aristocratic households, and the kind of public ceremony where the quality of the lighting was itself a statement about the importance of the event. When the historical record notes that a medieval feast was illuminated by 500 candles, it is communicating something about the wealth of the host, as clearly as it is communicating something about the luminosity of the room. Oil lamps were in some respects better, and in some respects worse than candles. Better, they were slightly more controllable, slightly less likely to tip over and set something on fire, and could be designed to produce a steadier flame with less dripping. Worse, the oil itself, whale oil, fish oil, vegetable oil, rendered animal fat, depending on what was locally available and affordable, was often expensive, often produced significant smoke and smell, and varied enormously in quality. A well-maintained oil lamp burning good, quality whale oil, in a clean glass vessel produced a reasonably respectable light. An oil lamp burning whatever rancid tallow derivative was available this week, with a wick that needed trimming and a reservoir that needed refilling, produced a sullen, unreliable glow that was almost more frustrating than no light at all, because it gave you just enough visibility to appreciate how much you couldn't see. Outside the house, the situation was worse. The streets of a pre-electric city at night were dark in a way that is genuinely difficult to conceptualize from a modern perspective. The absence of street lighting was not a minor inconvenience. It was an environmental condition that fundamentally shaped how people moved through urban space, who could move through it safely, who chose not to move through it at all, and what happened in the spaces where no one could see. Paris was the first city in the world to implement a systematic street lighting program. In 1667, Louis XIV's chief of police, Gabriel Nicolas de Lorraine installed oil lanterns on the streets of Paris, initially a few hundred, eventually several thousand, hung from ropes at roughly every 20 meters. The motivation was not romantic, it was practical in the most direct possible sense. Crime in Paris at night was so prevalent, and the inability of any authority to see or respond to it so absolute, that the city was functionally ungovernable after dark. The lanterns did not solve the problem entirely. They made certain streets slightly less dangerous and created a new crime, lantern breaking, that became sufficiently common to require its own regulations and penalties. Which sounds familiar. Which sounds, in fact, exactly like the story of every urban lighting upgrade ever attempted. The problem shifts, the geography of danger relocates, and the darkness retreats to the areas that the lights haven't reached yet. London followed with systematic street lighting, later in the 17th century, mandated first through requirements that householders hang lanterns outside their doors on certain dark nights, and then gradually through the development of a contracting system where lighting companies were paid to maintain oil lanterns on public streets. The early London street lamps were not exactly a triumph of infrastructure. They were dim, they went out in wind and rain, they required constant maintenance that was inconsistently provided, and they covered a minority of the streets where a minority of the people who needed them actually walked. But they existed, which was more than most cities managed for most of this period. Amsterdam famously resisted systematic street lighting for considerably longer, partly for reasons of municipal finance, and partly because Amsterdam in the 17th century operated a significant nighttime economy that was not entirely enthusiastic about enhanced visibility. Not every party wants to be seen. The people responsible for managing the night in the centuries before street lighting were the night watchmen, and their job description contains enough drama for several entire careers that somehow never gets made into television. The night watch was an institution of almost universal distribution in pre-modern cities. Some version of the same idea. Men patrolling the streets at night, responsible for public order and fire detection, appears in ancient Rome, in medieval European cities, in Ottoman Constantinople, in Ming Dynasty Beijing, in colonial American towns with local variations in organization and authority. But a broadly consistent function. You walked the streets. You carried a light. You shouted the time at regular intervals, which served both as a reassurance to people lying awake in their houses that a human presence was out there, and as a useful signal to anyone conducting illegal activities that a human presence was out there. You watched for fire. You dealt with whatever you found, which could range from a drunk sleeping in a doorway to an actual crime in progress, with very limited backup available, and no radio communication with anyone. The social status of the night watchman was not elevated. This is perhaps the most consistent feature across every culture that maintained the institution. The night watch was the job you took when you had run out of better options. Old men, injured men, men who could not find daytime employment for various reasons that the historical record is often tactful about. Men who were required by their guild or their neighborhood to take a rotation of watch duty that nobody particularly wanted. Rembrandt's famous painting of 1642, The Night Watch, which depicts Amsterdam's Civic Guard Company in a dramatic composition of light and shadow, is in some ways a tribute to the institution, and in other ways a very flattering portrait of people who, in their actual daily function, spent most of their time being cold and wet and slightly scared in the dark, which is its own form of courage, even if it is not the form that paintings usually celebrate. The word curfew comes from the French couvre, few, which means cover the fire. This etymology tells you something important about what nighttime meant before electricity. It was not primarily defined by the absence of light, or even the presence of danger. It was defined by fire. The curfew bell, rung in medieval towns at roughly 9 or 10 in the evening, was a signal that all hearth fires should be covered or extinguished for the night. A practical fire safety measure in cities of timber construction, where a single unattended hearth fire could become a city, consuming conflagration within an hour. The curfew was, at its origin, less about controlling where people went and more about controlling what people left burning while they slept. That it became, over time, a mechanism for controlling movement and imposing social order after dark is a historical development that would have seemed entirely logical to anyone who understood what uncontrolled fire could do to a neighbourhood. London burned in 1666. The Great Fire of London started in a bakery on Pudding Lane in the early hours of the 2nd of September, 1666, and burned for 4 days, destroying approximately 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of the medieval city within the Roman walls. The fire started in the dark, when a baker's oven was improperly banked for the night. It spread in the dark through streets of timber and thatch that had not been rained on adequately for months, while a city that was not particularly well organized for nighttime emergencies tried to figure out what was happening. By the time enough people were awake and responding with anything like coordinated effort, the fire had established itself in multiple locations and was no longer stoppable by any means short of deliberate demolition of buildings in its path to create fire breaks. The decision to demolish, which was itself contested, because the buildings being demolished belonged to someone, and that someone objected, came late, after the fire had already consumed what the fire breaks were meant to protect. The Great Fire is usually remembered as a daytime disaster, because the most famous images of it, the paintings, the contemporary engravings, show it against a dramatic red sky. But the fire that could not be contained, the fire that grew past the point where it could have been stopped, was a nighttime fire. The dark was not incidental to the disaster. The dark was structural. Beyond fire, what the night contained in the pre-electric imagination was a category of threat that we now file under superstition. But that, from inside the belief system, was experienced as a reasonable assessment of the evidence. The belief that night air was dangerous, specifically that the cold, damp air of nighttime carried diseases, that the day air did not, was not, in the pre-germ. Theory world, an unreasonable conclusion from the available data. People who were outside at night more often did, statistically, get sick more often. The correlation was real. The mechanism was wrong. What they were actually experiencing was the differential in temperature and humidity that affects the body's resistance to infection, the higher concentration of mosquitoes at dawn and dusk that transmitted actual diseases, the fact that people who were outside at night were often people who were poor, malnourished, and sleeping rough in conditions that were independently unhealthy. But the observed pattern was real enough that the inference drew obvious conclusions. Miasma theory, the belief that disease was caused by bad air, particularly the foul, smelling air near marshes, garbage, sewage, and decomposing organic matter, had been the dominant medical model in the Western world since Hippocrates, and would remain so until John Snow's cholera work in the 1850s and Pasteur's germ theory in the 1860s. Within miasma theory, nighttime had a specific danger profile. The cold, heavy night air sank toward the ground, concentrated in low lying areas and combined with the vapors rising from the earth, the sewage running in the gutters, and the general decomposition that everything was always involved in. The night air, from a miasmatic perspective, was the worst air available. Opening a window at night let the bad air in. Sleeping outside at night was medically reckless. Being out in the night fog, particularly near a river or a marsh, was the kind of behaviour that would get you a very concerned look from your physician. This tells you something important about why the word malaria means, literally, bad air. The disease was correctly identified as concentrated in marshy, low-lying areas with bad nighttime air long before anyone knew that it was transmitted by mosquitoes that bred in those marshy areas and were most active at dusk and dawn. The mechanism was wrong. The risk assessment was right. And the night in which the air became bad and the mosquitoes were most active and the miasma rose from the low ground was where the disease lived, which was another reason, added to the already considerable list, not to be out in it. The moon had its own special category of nighttime danger, and the English language still carries the evidence of how seriously people took it. Lunacy, lunatic. Both words derive from luna, the Latin word for moon. The belief that the full moon affected human mental states, causing instability, irrationality, violent behaviour, and the specific condition of what we now call psychosis, was not a fringe opinion or a superstition of the uneducated. It was a mainstream medical position endorsed by physicians, philosophers, and legal systems across multiple cultures for most of recorded history. It appears in Hippocrates. It appears in Aristotle. It appears in medical textbooks of the medieval and early modern period. English courts heard legal arguments about whether a defendant's lunacy was genuine, proven by the testimony of neighbours about their behaviour around full moons, as a mitigating factor in criminal cases. The word lunatic appears in law codes. The association was taken completely seriously. The mechanism proposed for lunar influence on mental states was, within the available scientific framework, coherent. The moon affected the tides, which meant the moon had demonstrable effects on large bodies of water. The human body was largely water. Therefore, the moon affected the fluids in the human body, which affected the brain, which affected the mind. This is wrong in every specific detail. It is also not an embarrassingly stupid inference from the evidence available at the time, and it produced a very specific attitude toward the full moon at night. A thing that made the dark brighter was also a thing that made people who were already unwell or unstable more dangerous. The night of the full moon was the night the lunatic might wander. It was the night to be careful. What actually happened in the dark, setting aside the medical theories, is perhaps more interesting than the theories themselves. Crime at night was genuinely different from crime during the day, in ways that shaped both the nature of the crimes committed and the experience of being a potential victim. The dark in the pre-electric city was not a neutral environment. It was structurally advantageous to anyone who needed not to be seen. Robbery in the street at night was common enough that specific legal categories for it, footpad robbery, highway robbery, were well established and well punished, with the well-punished part doing relatively little to reduce the frequency, because the probability of being caught in adequate darkness was low enough to make the deterrent effect marginal. The people who were robbed were the people who were out at night, and the people who were out at night were a specific population, people who had to be, people who had no choice, people who worked night schedules, and people who were themselves engaged in activities that benefited from darkness. The night also had its professional class of people who performed necessary services in the dark that could not or would not be performed in daylight. Night soil collectors, the workers who removed human waste from cesspits and privies under cover of darkness, loaded it onto carts, and transported it outside the city for use as agricultural fertilizer, were a feature of every pre-modern city. Their work happened at night partly because the smell was genuinely overpowering, and partly because the sight of carts piled with night soil, moving through residential streets, during the day raised objections that nighttime invisibility conveniently prevented. This was practical public health policy of a specific kind, not solving the sanitation problem, but relocating the experience of it to hours when most people were asleep. The night soil collectors had their own guild organizations in some cities, their own rate schedules, their own disputes with clients about payment for difficult cesspits. They were an industry. They operated in the dark because everyone agreed that was better, including them, since nighttime meant no audience, and no one complaining about the smell from an open window. Link boys were another profession native to nighttime darkness. Young men and boys, sometimes as young as 8 or 10, who carried torches and lanterns in the streets, and guided paying customers from one location to another through the dark city. The torch they carried was called a link, which gave the profession its name. In London, they were a recognised feature of nighttime urban life, from at least the 16th century through to the introduction of systematic street lighting. You hired a link boy at the theatre, or the inn, or wherever you were finishing your evening, and he walked ahead of you with his light, illuminating the road, identifying obstacles, deterring opportunistic robbers who preferred to work in darkness rather than in the light of a torch held by a small child who would definitely be heard if he shouted. The irony that the safety system for wealthy people walking at night consisted of posting a small underpaid child at the front was not lost on everyone, but it was not a detail that significantly troubled most users of the service. Linked boys also had a reputation for crime, specifically for guiding clients into ambushes set by their accomplices, leading a wealthy customer down a dark alley where friends with different intentions were waiting. Whether this reputation was deserved by the majority of link boys or reflected the ordinary suspicion that the propertied classes extended toward the working poor who provided them services is a matter on which historians have nuanced views and no definitive statistics. What is clear is that hiring a link boy was a calculated risk that most people decided was worth taking, which tells you something about how bad the alternative of walking without one was. Sleep itself was different in the pre-electric world, and the difference is one of the more surprising findings of recent historical research into pre-industrial daily life. The dominant assumption in the modern understanding of human sleep is that we sleep in a single consolidated block of 7 to 8 hours. Go to bed. Sleep. Wake up. This pattern, it turns out, is not the universal human norm. It is the modern industrial norm, shaped by the structure of the industrial workday and reinforced by the availability of artificial light that allows people to stay awake comfortably until a late enough hour, that when they do sleep, they sleep through to morning without interruption. Before artificial light reshaped the daily schedule, a different sleep pattern was common across much of the Western world. 2 sleeps, with a period of waking in between. The historian A. Roger Eckerch documented this pattern extensively in his 2005 book, At Day's Close, Night in Times Past. The pre-industrial pattern he found in the historical record, in court documents, in diaries, in medical texts, in literature, involved a first sleep starting at dusk or shortly after, lasting several hours, followed by a period of waking that might last an hour or two, followed by a second sleep that continued until dawn. The waking period between the two sleeps was not a problem to be solved. It was a recognized part of the night, during which people did things. They got up and used the chamber pot. They prayed. They talked with their spouse or household members. They had sex. The period between first and second sleep was apparently considered an excellent time for sexual activity, with a somewhat different physiological character than nighttime sex that modern humans have been robbed of, and do not know they are missing. They checked on animals. They worked by firelight on tasks that did not require moving around much. And then they went back to sleep. The transition to single consolidated sleep happened gradually, beginning in the late 17th century in urban areas and accelerating through the industrial period. The extension of evening activity through artificial light pushed bedtime later. A later bedtime, combined with a fixed work start time, reduced the total hours available for sleep. The waking period between first and second sleep was, in this compressed schedule, the first thing to go. And then it simply ceased to be part of most people's experience of night, and the memory of it faded, and eventually the entire concept of a first and second sleep became so unfamiliar that when historians started finding references to it in historical sources, they initially assumed they were misunderstanding something. You were not misunderstanding. The night used to have a middle, and we stopped going there. The spirits and creatures that inhabited the pre-electric dark were not, from inside the worldview that produced them, simple superstitions. They were attempts to name and categorize what was actually present in an environment that was genuinely dark, genuinely dangerous, and genuinely unpredictable in ways that called for explanation. Vampires as a folk belief, rather than as a Gothic literary trope, were a feature of Eastern European popular culture for centuries before Bram Stoker systematized them into the form that modern popular culture recognizes. The folkloric vampire, the Strigoami of Romania, the Vrikalakas of Greece, various related creatures across a wide geographic area, was typically a dead person who had not stayed properly dead, who returned to drain the life of the living, usually beginning with family members. The characteristics that defined vampire suspicion in these folk traditions are illuminating. The suspected vampire was often a person who had died of infectious disease. The deaths of family members who followed were attributed to the vampire, rather than to the disease spreading through the household. The correlation between a death, subsequent deaths, and an identified source was real. The mechanism, contagion, was invisible and not yet understood. The vampiric mechanism, a dead person moving through the night to drain the living, was at least a legible explanation. The vampire also came at night, which was the period during which the unexplained things happened, and the bad things spread, and which was therefore the obvious operating environment for whatever was causing the unexplained and bad things. This is not irrational. It is pattern, matching in a context where the relevant patterns are genuinely there, and the mechanism that explains them is not yet available. Werewolves occupy a similar explanatory space for the violence that happened at the edges of pre-electric civilization. Large predators, wolves, bears, were a real feature of the landscape of pre-modern Europe, and attacks on humans and livestock at night were a real occurrence. The transition between human and animal, between daylight social person and nighttime predatory force, captured something real about the way the night transformed the relationship between the human community and the world beyond the settlement boundary. Something that looked like a person in the day could be something else at night. The night could transform people. The night, specifically, was where the transformation happened. Willow, the wisp, the ignis fatuus, the foolish fire, was a real atmospheric phenomenon, with a natural explanation that pre-electric people were not in a position to access. Spontaneous ignition of marsh gas, specifically methane and phosphine, rising from decomposing organic matter in wetlands, produces small, floating flames that appear and disappear in low-lying areas at night. They were real. They were visible. They had no obvious source, and could not be approached or followed, consistently, because they responded to air currents in ways that made them appear to move deliberately. Every culture that lived near marshland had a name for them, and an explanation. Spirits of the dead, fairy lights, the ghosts of unbaptized children, the lamps of trickster entities that lured travellers off safe paths and into the bog. The explanation was wrong. The phenomenon was real and was genuinely observed, frequently at night, in exactly the dark and isolated environments where people were already most susceptible to fear. Phosphorescent meat and fish. Organic matter in the process of decomposition sometimes produces a cold blue-green glow from bioluminescent bacteria, generated its own category of nighttime fear. If you came downstairs in the dark and your stored meat was glowing, the natural explanation available to you was not microbiology. It was something in the meat, something wrong, something that happened in the night to things that had been fine during the day. The glowing meat, which was actually a product of the decomposition process being visible in darkness that would have obscured it during daylight, contributed to the general conviction that the night was a transformative environment, a place where ordinary things became other things. Cats were already complicated in the pre-electric world, but the specific association between cats and the night, and between cats and witchcraft, and between cats and women who were suspected of witchcraft, has its own logic. Cats can see in very low light conditions that are functionally dark to human perception. A cat that moved confidently through darkness, that seemed at home in the environment that humans most feared, that appeared suddenly from nowhere and disappeared back into the dark with equal inexplicability, was demonstrating a capacity that from the human perspective required explanation. Either the cat was not subject to the normal rules of the night, or the cat had access to resources that humans did not, or the cat was in some arrangement with whatever was in the dark that allowed for safe passage. None of these explanations is true. All of them made narrative sense to people who could not see in the dark and were watching an animal that apparently could. The specific association between old women, cats, and night was culturally constructed, but built on real observations. Older women who lived alone were more likely to keep cats for companionship and rodent control, more likely to be up at odd hours, insomnia being a feature of age that has not changed, and therefore more likely to be seen moving around at night, in ways that the community found interpretable as suspicious. The night, in pre-electric society, was not a private space. Everyone's nighttime behavior was theoretically observable by everyone else, because the sounds of the night carried in ways that daylight noise obscured, and because anyone who was up and moving when the community was asleep was visible against the general background of people who were not. Being out at night was itself a mark. Being out at night, regularly, if you were the kind of person that social suspicion already attached to, was evidence of something. The one class of people for whom nighttime was not primarily an environment of fear, but of privilege was, predictably, the class that could afford enough light to push the dark back. Aristocratic night culture, masked balls, late suppers, gambling that ran through to dawn, the performance of social life in candlelit rooms that required enough candles to actually illuminate the space rather than just gesture at it, was a performance of wealth as much as an activity of enjoyment. The ability to stay up late, to eat by candlelight, to move through the night in a carriage with outriders carrying torches, to hold events that ordinary people could not afford to light, was a class statement as clear as any heraldic display. The aristocracy did not fear the night because they could afford not to. The night, for them, was a setting for theatrical social performance rather than an environment to be survived. This is the version of pre-electric night that the historical imagination most easily accesses. The chandeliers, the masks, the gambling, the intrigue. It is also the version that applied to perhaps 2% of the population at most. For the other 98%, the candle count was lower, the dark was closer, and the night was a period to be endured rather than enjoyed. The first significant improvement to indoor artificial lighting in the Western world came in 1780, when a Swiss physicist named Aim Argand invented the Argand lamp, an oil lamp with a cylindrical wick and a glass chimney that, for the first time, allowed combustion air to reach the interior of the flame as well as the exterior. The result was a lamp that burned approximately 10 times brighter than a standard candle and produced significantly less smoke. The Argand lamp was not cheap. It required good quality whale oil, which was becoming expensive as whale populations declined under commercial hunting pressure. But it was genuinely transformative for the households that could afford it. For the first time, a single lamp could actually illuminate a room, rather than just creating a local island of visibility in a sea of dark. Gas lighting followed, with London's Pall Mall becoming the first street in the world to be continuously lit by gas lamps in 1807. The project organised by Friedrich Albert Windsor, a German promoter who had observed gas lighting demonstrations and understood immediately that the combination of continuous fuel supply through pipes and a much brighter and more stable flame than oil represented a qualitative improvement that urban governments would eventually be unable to resist. The early gas lamps were still unreliable. The supply pressure varied. The flames sometimes went out. The infrastructure leaked. But the brightness was genuinely different from oil. A well-functioning gas lamp was, to eyes accustomed to oil and candle, almost shockingly bright. It was still nothing compared to what came next. Thomas Edison's development of a practical incandescent bulb in 1879 and the subsequent construction of Pearl Street Station in Manhattan in 1882, the first commercial electrical generating station providing power to customers, did not immediately end the era of the night as darkness. Electrification was slow, uneven, contested, and expensive. Rural areas in much of the industrialized world were not fully electrified until the 1940s and 1950s, which means that the era of pre-electric night that this video describes is for significant portions of the global population, within living memory. The grandmother of someone watching this tonight may have grown up in a house without electric light, doing homework by kerosene lamp, knowing the precise distances between islands of streetlight on the road to town, understanding in a way that people who have always had electricity simply don't, that the dark is a thing rather than just an absence of a thing. The transition to electric light did not only illuminate the physical environment, it transformed the social structure of night in ways that were not all improvements, and some of which we are still working through. The first sleep and second sleep pattern, the bimodal sleep architecture that adapted human rest to the rhythms of pre-electric darkness, was disrupted. The street crime that had organized itself around the geography of light and dark had to reorganize around a new geography. The specific professional class of people who worked in and with darkness, night watchmen, link boys, the various trades organized around the management of artificial light sources, became obsolete within a generation. The creatures and spirits that had inhabited the dark did not disappear. They retreated into fiction, into children's stories, into the cultural residue of fears that had been real. And some things became visible that the dark had been keeping hidden, which was not always comfortable for anyone. The night had been, among its other functions, a privacy. The dark had been a space where the poor were not observed by the comfortable, where the unsanctioned could occur without witness, where the city's dignitaries could not see exactly how many people were sleeping in the streets. Gaslight and electric light brought these things into visibility, which was sometimes called progress. The specific economics of artificial light in the pre-electric world are worth understanding, because they explain more directly than almost anything else why the darkness was as dark as it was for as long as it was. Light cost money. This is a statement so obvious as to seem meaningless until you consider what it meant in practical terms for households operating on subsistence or near subsistence budgets. In 16th century England, tallow candles sufficient for a single evening of reading, perhaps 3 or 4 hours of usable light, represented a meaningful fraction of a labourer's daily wage. Not a catastrophic fraction, but meaningful. A household that burned candles every evening for a year was spending real money on light. Money that was competing with food, clothing, rent, and every other claim on a limited budget. The rational response to this constraint was to use less light, which meant going to bed earlier in winter when the dark came earlier, working and moving and socializing during daylight hours as much as possible, and accepting that certain activities, reading, detailed handwork, the kinds of domestic tasks that required close vision, were daylight activities unless you had particular reason to prioritize them at night. The rush light was a specifically poor person's lighting technology that makes the economics of light stark and legible. A rush light was made by peeling a rush, the common marsh plant, leaving only a thin strip of the green outer skin on one side to serve as a support, soaking the exposed pith in animal fat, and then burning the resulting cheap candle in a special holder that gripped the rush at an angle. The light produced was faint, the burn time was short, and the technology required periodic replacement with a new rush. But the cost was approximately zero if you lived near a marsh, which many poor rural households did, and the animal fat required for soaking was a byproduct of cooking that would otherwise be discarded. The rush light was the very bottom of the lighting economy, the light you made when you could not afford to buy. Gilbert White, the 18th century English naturalist, calculated that a single pound of fat could produce enough rush lights to supply a cottager family for a year. A single pound of fat, which would be saved from the cooking pot over the course of weeks, purchased roughly a year of evening light. It was not good light. It was barely light at all. It was the difference between total darkness and a faint glow that was enough to locate the chamber pot without incident, which was a lower bar than we typically set for adequate illumination, but was, in the circumstances, the relevant metric. The tallow chandler's trade, the professional production of tallow candles, was a recognised craft guild in English, French, and Dutch cities by at least the 13th century, which tells you that the demand for manufactured candles was sufficient to support a specialised industry, even at that early date. The chandler bought tallow, rendered beef and mutton fat, the byproduct of butchery, and processed it into candles through a laborious dipping process. Wicking was repeatedly dipped into the liquid tallow, allowed to cool and solidify, dipped again, cooled again, until a candle of usable diameter had been built up layer by layer. The smell of a working tallow chandler's operation was notable even by the standards of medieval urban environments, which is a sentence that requires some contextual understanding of what medieval urban environments smelled like. The guilds were accordingly regulated. Chandlers were subject to rules about where they could practice their trade, often restricted to areas outside the main commercial centre, a zoning decision whose logic was primarily olfactory. The distinction between tallow candles and beeswax candles was not only economic but religious and social. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, smelled better, and produced a whiter, brighter flame. The Catholic Church specified beeswax candles for liturgical use, a requirement that drove a substantial market for wax candles and gave the church a legitimate commercial interest in beekeeping operations. The Paschal candle, a large single candle used in Easter ceremonies, was specified as pure beeswax and was expected to be impressive in size. Purchasing, maintaining, and displaying enough beeswax candles to adequately light a cathedral for high services was a significant ongoing expense for ecclesiastical institutions, and the economics of beeswax production influenced the economics of monastery beekeeping across medieval Europe in ways that connect candle snuffing, religious ceremony, and agricultural management in a chain that seems unlikely until you trace it. The window tax, introduced in England in 1696 and finally repealed in 1851, created an accidental relationship between taxation and darkness that its architects either did not fully anticipate or did not particularly care about. The tax worked by counting windows. Houses with fewer than 10 windows paid nothing. Houses with 10 or more paid incrementally more depending on the total count. The intent was to create a tax on wealth. Wealthy people lived in large houses with many windows, so a window tax was, in theory, a wealth tax. The effect was to make windows expensive, which led to an entirely predictable response. People bricked up windows to reduce their tax liability, particularly windows that could be blocked without catastrophic loss of ventilation and light. The result, across English cities and towns, was a generation of houses with bricked or blocked windows. Houses that were darker than they would otherwise have been. Houses whose occupants had made a rational economic calculation that paying for light by leaving windows open was more expensive than paying with darkness by sealing them shut. The phrase daylight robbery, which in modern usage means an unreasonably high price, has been proposed as a folk memory of the window tax, on the theory that taxing daylight itself was robbery. Etymologists are not uniformly convinced that the phrase has this specific origin, but the cultural memory of a world in which natural light was literally taxed, in which the government extracted money from householders specifically based on how much daylight their homes admitted, is the kind of thing that could, over time, become embedded in the language as a general expression for egregious extraction. The night in the countryside was different from the night in the city, in ways that matter for understanding the full range of pre-electric darkness. In the city, darkness was punctuated and uneven. There were neighbourhoods with more lanterns and neighbourhoods with none. Streets that were nominally lit and streets that were not. Houses where candlelight escaped through windows and houses that were shuttered and dark. The darkness of a pre-electric city at night was not total. It was a patchwork of varying degrees of dim, interrupted by the occasional torch, the occasional lantern, the occasional brightly lit window of a tavern or a house where something was happening. Enough variation that movement was possible, that the city remained navigable to those who knew it, that the most determined and the most desperate could find their way through. In the countryside, on a moonless night with cloud cover, there was nothing. The nearest settlement might be miles away. The road, if it was a road rather than a track, was not marked or lit in any way. The fields on either side were invisible. The trees, if there were trees, were shapes that were slightly darker than the sky, visible only because the sky, even clouded, retained some faint atmospheric luminance from starlight above the clouds. Walking in this environment required either the familiarity that comes from having walked the same path hundreds of times in daylight, a spatial memory of the landscape so detailed that you could navigate it without seeing it, or the acceptance that you were going to walk slowly, feel the surface of the road with your feet, and arrive at your destination significantly later than expected. Farmers who needed to walk any distance on moonless nights, labourers who had been working late and needed to get home before their household locked the door, travellers who had misjudged the daylight remaining when they left the last town. These people navigated by a combination of memorised spatial knowledge, tactile feedback, and a kind of deliberate attention to the minor variations in darkness that human eyes, fully dark, adapted, can detect. Dark, adapted human vision is actually significantly more capable than most people realise. In conditions of very low light, the rod cells of the retina, which are sensitive to brightness rather than colour, can detect the shape of large objects, the difference between open sky and tree line, the outline of a building against a slightly lighter sky. What dark, adapted human vision cannot do in the countryside on a moonless clouded night is navigate a road or detect objects at the feet. People fell into drainage ditches, off the edges of bridges, into each other occasionally in mutual confusion. The relationship between the night and the inn was, accordingly, one of the most important practical relationships in pre-electric travel culture. The inn was not primarily a place to eat and drink. It was a place to stop. The calculation that governed travel in the pre-electric world was not, can I get there by nightfall, which was the modern motorist's calculation, but where will I be when it gets dark? And is that somewhere that I want to be when it gets dark? The answer almost always was at an inn, with a door that locked, a room that could be lit, food that someone else had prepared, and the reasonable expectation of not being robbed in the night by whoever happened to find you sleeping in a ditch. The inn was the infrastructure of nighttime survival for travelling people, and the geography of inn distribution, which routes were in, dense which were not, effectively determined which routes were usable for travellers who could not walk from one major settlement to another in a single day. The quality of inn accommodation varied across a range that makes the modern hospitality industry's complaints about negative reviews seem proportionate. At the low end, a shared bed, sometimes with strangers, in a room with other shared beds, in a building with uncertain fire safety, serving food that was whatever the innkeeper had available, with no guarantee that you would have your belongings in the morning that you had in the evening. At the high end, a private room, reasonable food, secure stabling for horses, staff who would wake you at the hour you specified, the specific comfort of sleeping somewhere that other people were also sleeping, and therefore someone would notice if something went catastrophically wrong. The distinction between these two categories was primarily monetary. Wealthy travellers carried enough money to pay for the high end. Everyone else negotiated. The highway at night was a specific environment that highway robbery as a crime exploited structurally. The highwayman, the mounted robber, who operated on the major roads between cities, was not a figure of the urban dark. He was a figure of the rural dark, specifically the stretches of road between settlements where the darkness was complete, the nearest help was far away, and the only people present were travellers and whoever had decided to wait for them. Highwaymen are a staple of romantic historical fiction, in a way that somewhat misrepresents the actual experience of being stopped by one at gunpoint on a dark road, with no one in earshot. The experience was not romantic. It was terrifying in the specific way of being helpless and isolated in the dark, with violence as an available option for the other party, and no immediately accessible alternative. The legal response to highway robbery was eventually severe enough to constitute a deterrence. Conviction meant hanging, and the display of the hanged body at the site of the crime or at a prominent crossroads was a standard practice intended to communicate to future travellers that authority had noted the crime and future criminals, that authority had consequences. Whether this deterred highway robbery significantly is the usual question about deterrence through punishment. The highway remained dangerous at night. The gallows along the roadside were a feature of the landscape. The specific geography of the hangings, the crossroads, the prominent trees, the sites where multiple roads met, was woven into the landscape's night mythology in ways that made the dark countryside more rather than less frightening, since now the crossroads was both the place where criminals had been hanged and the place where, in folk belief, the spirits of the dishonestly buried wandered without rest. Crossroads had their own extensive supernatural mythology, independent of the hangings, rooted in pre-Christian beliefs about boundary spaces and the transition between worlds. A crossroads was not quite inside one territory or another. It was the intersection of paths that went to different places, none of which was exactly here. In the geography of folk belief, this made crossroads liminal spaces, places where the boundary between the living world and other kinds of world was thin. Suicides were buried at crossroads in many European traditions. For exactly this reason, they were not quite inside the community's normal territory of burial, and they were in a place where the transition between worlds was easier, which was either a comfort or a threat, depending on which side of death you were considering the question from. At night, the crossroads, dark, isolated, marked by a gibbet or a suicide's unmarked grave, was the place you did not stop if you could avoid it. The specific psychology of pre-electric darkness was not simply fear. It was something more textured than fear. A trained attentiveness, a calibration of the senses to an environment where normal visual information was unavailable, and other information sources became primary. People who lived with pre-electric darkness on a regular basis developed a specific set of skills and habits. They knew which floorboards in their house creaked and which did not as a trivial piece of domestic knowledge, but as navigation data for moving through the house at night without waking people. They knew by sound which animals in their household were making their normal nighttime sounds, and which were making sounds that indicated something unusual. They knew the difference between the sounds a house makes as it cools at night and the sounds a house makes when something else is happening. They listened for fire, the specific crackling and smell of uncontrolled combustion that distinguished a house fire from a hearth fire, with the sustained vigilance of people who understood that fire was the primary catastrophic risk to every household, and that the night was when fires most often escaped control. Children were trained in darkness literacy from early ages, not as a deliberate curriculum, but as a necessary adaptation. A child in a pre-electric household learned quickly that the dark was not a uniform environment, that some locations were safer in the dark than others, that moving through a familiar space in darkness was different from moving through an unfamiliar one, and that the imagination tends to populate unexplored dark spaces with things that are not there. The specific fears of childhood, the monster under the bed, the something in the corner, the presence that was not visible but was definitely there, were not individual pathology in a pre-electric world. They were a normal response to an environment where the visible world ended a few feet from the nearest candle, and nothing about what was beyond that radius was guaranteed. Adults managed these fears through a combination of habituation, practical necessity, and the specific social supports that pre-electric night culture had developed for the purpose. The night prayer was partly religious obligation and partly a functional anxiety management system, the act of naming what you feared, placing it in a cosmological context where protection was available, and completing a ritual that marked the transition from the waking world to sleep, served the psychological function of closing the door on the unstructured darkness, and replacing it with a narrative in which you were, if not safe, at least not alone. The candle that was lit before going to bed, the specific prayer said before extinguishing it, the placement of the dying light in a spot that would catch a fire, if the candle tipped but not spread it immediately to the bedding, was a ritual whose every element had been refined by practice into a procedure for managing the transition from light to dark that minimized both physical risk and psychological distress. It was a bedtime routine, recognizable across cultures and centuries, that did not produce safety so much as it produced the conditions under which sleep was possible despite the darkness, which is, when you think about it, exactly what bedtime routines are still trying to do. The religious institutions of pre-electric Europe had their own particular relationship to the night, which was shaped by the theological conviction that prayer did not stop when the light did. The monastic hours, the liturgy of the hours, the divine office, divided the day and night into a structured sequence of prayer times that required monks and nuns to be awake and praying at intervals that the night found inconvenient. Vigils or matins was prayed in the middle of the night, typically around 2 or 3 in the morning, depending on the order and the season, requiring monastic communities to wake from sleep, move through cold stone buildings in darkness, and sing or recite the night office before returning to bed for the second sleep. Lauds was prayed at dawn. The night office requirement meant that monastic communities were regularly occupying dark spaces at night, in organized, structured ways that were different from the fearful darkness of ordinary experience. The bells that called the monastery to prayer also served, in medieval towns, as the primary public timekeeping system. The monastery bell at matins, rung at 2 or 3 in the morning, was heard throughout the town. It marked the deepest point of the night. It confirmed that the night was moving, that the hours were passing, that dawn was coming. For people lying awake between their first and second sleep, listening to the monastery bells in the dark. The bell at Compline marking the official end of the day, the bell at Matins marking the deep middle of the night, the bell at Lourdes marking the approach of dawn, was a form of night navigation. The bells told you where you were in the dark, without telling you what was there. The cathedral and church buildings themselves were places of specific nighttime significance. After dark, in a pre-electric town, the church building was one of the few places where significant quantities of light regularly appeared at night. Feast day celebrations, high masses, the perpetual light burning before the Blessed Sacrament. These produced in the darkened town islands of light and sound that served as navigational markers and social anchors. The light coming from church windows at night was, for a person moving through the dark town, visible from a significant distance. It meant, here is a place, here are people, here is something that is not darkness. The graveyards that surrounded most pre-electric churches had their own nocturnal character that was shaped by specific practical realities as much as by supernatural belief. Pre-electric graveyards produced, under certain conditions, a faint phosphorescent glow visible on dark nights. The glow came from the same bioluminescent bacterial processes that produced the glowing meat mentioned earlier, decomposing organic matter in the right conditions of temperature and humidity generates bacterial bioluminescence that produces a pale blue-green light. In a graveyard, the shallow burials and disturbed soil of older graves could create the conditions for this luminescence, visible as a faint glow over certain areas of the graveyard on warm, humid nights. This phenomenon was real, was observed, and was interpreted, naturally given the location, as the lights of the dead. The ghost lights of the graveyard, like the will over the wisp of the marsh, were natural phenomena that the pre-electric mind correctly identified as a real and anomalous light source, and incorrectly attributed to supernatural agency. The attribution was wrong. The observation was accurate. The professional gravediggers who worked in these spaces at night, because burials in cities sometimes had to be conducted at night to manage the logistics of the charnel houses and the city's limited burial space, were people who had habituated themselves to an environment that most people found genuinely terrifying. The graveyard at night was cold, quiet, occupied by the dead, in the most literal sense, occasionally producing anomalous light from the ground, located at the edge of the settled area where the darkness was less penetrated by the ambient light of the town. The gravedigger who spent nights in these spaces developed a professional relationship with them that required either complete habituation to fear or the complete replacement of fearful imagination with practical assessment. The grave needs to be this deep. The soil here is difficult. The phosphorescence is coming from over there. It is bacteria. The last one, he probably did not say. The night that pre-electric people navigated was also, in one respect, significantly more beautiful than the night that most modern people experience. The sky, before electric light created the atmospheric haze that now prevents most of the world's population from ever seeing a genuinely dark night sky. The stars were visible from inhabited areas in numbers, and with a clarity that modern urban people essentially never experience. The Milky Way, the dense band of stars that represents the edge of our galaxy seen from inside, was in the pre-electric world, visible from any location with a clear sky view, a dramatic feature of the night overhead that was part of the ordinary visual environment of nighttime, rather than a special sight requiring a drive to a national park. The planets were visible as distinct coloured objects. Shooting stars were frequent enough to be unremarkable. The night sky was, in the absence of light pollution, a map, a clock, a calendar, and a source of orientation that people read with the fluency that comes from a lifetime of exposure. Navigators at sea used stars with a precision that modern GPS navigation has replaced, but not exceeded in terms of the underlying skill required. A ship's navigator in the pre-electric era could determine latitude from the altitude of the North Star above the horizon, could read the time of night from the position of specific stars relative to the horizon, could identify their approximate longitudinal position through complex calculations involving stellar observations taken at known times. The night sky was a technology as much as it was a landscape feature, and the people who could read it fluently had a capacity for orientation and navigation that was genuinely powerful in an era before any other means of finding your position at sea was available. On land, farmers read the night sky as a weather instrument and an agricultural calendar. The Pleiades rising in the east after sunset in spring told you it was time for certain planting activities. Orion's position told you the season. The moon's phase told you not only the time within the month, but, in many agricultural traditions, something about the appropriate activities for that period. The widespread belief that planting during a waxing moon was better than planting during a waning moon was not, as far as modern agricultural science can determine, accurate. But the observation on which it was based, that the moon's phase is a reliable marker of time within the agricultural cycle, was correct. The moon was the pre-electric calendar. The stars were the pre-electric clock. Both were visible only because the sky was dark. The loss of this sky, which happened gradually through the 19th and 20th centuries as electrification spread, was not noted as a loss by the people experiencing it. Because the gains of electrification were so overwhelming and so immediate, and so desired that the disappearance of the dark sky was simply not registered as something that was being traded away. You do not mourn what you never knew you had. The children growing up in electrified cities in 1920 had never known a dark sky, had never understood the Milky Way as a feature of the ordinary night overhead, and therefore did not miss it. Their grandparents, some of them, might have remembered the darker skies of their rural childhoods. But the memory was not the kind of thing that generated political movements or conservation campaigns. That came later, when astronomers began to document the problem, and public figures like Carl Sagan began to make the philosophical case for the night sky as a heritage worth protecting. The first dark sky preserve was designated in 1993. There are now several hundred designated dark sky areas globally. They exist because the light of our civilization has, in the course of roughly a century, washed out a night sky that human beings looked at for all of their existence before 1880, and we have decided collectively, and somewhat belatedly, that this is worth noting. The night had a sound profile that has disappeared as completely as the dark sky. Pre-electric cities were not silent at night. They were differently noisy than during the day, with the daytime noise of commerce and crowds and wheeled vehicles on stone streets replaced by a nighttime noise profile that was its own specific environment. The dominant sounds of a pre-electric city at night were the watchman's cry, announcing the time and the state of the weather, the bells of the churches marking the hours, the distant sound of animals, dogs, horses, the occasional livestock that had escaped its pen, the sound of fire, if there was fire, which was a possibility that the night watch was trained to assess at all times, and, in the quiet between these markers, the sounds that a city makes when it is sleeping, which include a great deal more coughing, shifting, and human noise from inadequately soundproofed buildings than modern urban environments typically produce. The watchman's cry was a specific genre of nighttime sound that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Past 11 o'clock, and a cloudy night. All is well. This, or something closely equivalent, was shouted at intervals by the night watch in London, and in comparable forms in cities across Europe, with local variations in the specific hour, called "and the specific information" included. The cry served as a time announcement for anyone awake and interested in the hour, as a fire report confirming that no fire was visible from the current position, as a presence indicator confirming that a human authority was on the street, and the immediate area was under observation, and as a specific deterrent to anyone conducting business in the dark, who would prefer not to be observed by a human authority. Whether the watchman's cry actually deterred crime is the same question as whether it deterred crime in every era where authority makes its presence known. It deterred crime in the area immediately visible to the watchman, and displaced it to the areas the watchman was not currently watching. The city at 2 in the morning, the deep middle of the night, between the last evening activity and the first morning stirring, produced sounds that a person lying awake in the first sleep to second sleep-waking period could interpret as a kind of acoustic map. Distant bells, a dog somewhere to the south, cartwheels too far away and too irregular to be commerce, probably a night soil cart, no shouts, which meant no alarm, the watchman's cry from the next street, another watchman's response from further away. The sounds of the night, read correctly, told you that the city was functioning normally, that the dark was not concealing anything that the watch had identified as abnormal, and that you could go back to sleep for the second sleep without significant concern. Reading the night acoustically was a skill, like reading the dark sky was a skill, that pre-electric people maintained, and that most modern people have not needed to develop. The specific sounds that triggered alarm were shouting, of any kind. In the night, the sound of running, which in the dark night street had no innocent explanation that came easily to mind. The smell of smoke in quantities beyond what a hearth fire would produce. The sound of glass breaking, the cry of fire, or its equivalent, which in the pre-electric city was the single most feared utterance after dark and produced, even when false, an immediate and significant social response. The social response to a fire cry in a pre-electric city was organized but terrifying. Firefighting in the pre-electric era was not professional in the modern sense until relatively recently. The London Fire Brigade, as a publicly funded professional service, dates from 1865. Before that, fire response in English cities was organised through a combination of insurance company brigades. Fire marks on houses indicated which company covered the property, and the company's brigade responded accordingly, with uninsured buildings receiving attention only if failing to suppress the fire in them threatened insured buildings. And parish bucket chains, the organised human chain passing leather buckets of water from the nearest source to the fire. The bucket chain was the primary fire suppression technology for most of urban history, and its effectiveness depended on the number of people available to form the chain, which depended on how many people had been awakened and responded. The proximity of a water source, which depended on where the fire started, the speed of response, which depended on how quickly the alarm was raised, and how quickly people reached the scene, and the weather, which was a variable that fire had always exploited. The great urban fires of pre-electric history share certain structural features, because those features were structural to the fire problem of pre-electric cities. They started at night, when response was slow. They spread quickly, because timber and thatch construction was the norm. They were suppressed or escaped based on wind direction, water proximity, and the speed of organised response in conditions of darkness and chaos. And they left behind documentation of their causes that reflects the specific nighttime circumstances that allowed them to spread before anyone could stop them. The Great Fire of London in 1666, the Edo Fire of 1657 in Japan, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, all of these shared the feature of initial suppression failure, and the initial suppression failure in each case was shaped by darkness, distance, and the specific difficulty of organising a large collective response in conditions where most of the people needed for the response were asleep. The Edo Fire of 1657 killed between 60 and 100,000 people. The death toll remains uncertain, and the range reflects genuine historical ambiguity about the scale of the disaster, making it one of the deadliest urban fire disasters in recorded history. It began in the middle of a dry, windy winter night in a city of wooden construction, whose population density was among the highest in the world. The combination of wind, dry conditions, and the density of combustible material meant that the fire spread faster than the city's organizational capacity to respond. By the time the sun rose on the 2nd of March, 1657, a significant portion of Edo, the city that would become Tokyo, was gone. The night had provided the hours in which the fire established itself beyond the possibility of suppression. The day provided only the light to see what had been lost. Nighttime in pre-electric cities was also organized around certain specific industries that could not operate during daylight for various reasons, and had therefore adapted to darkness as their working environment. The baker's trade was nocturnal by necessity. Bread had to be available at the beginning of the working day, which meant the bread had to be baked through the night, which meant the bakehouse was lit and heated through the hours when the rest of the city was dark and cold. The baker's apprentice who rose at midnight to begin the first preparations, who fired the oven through the early morning hours, who pulled the first loaves at dawn for the market, was one of the specific populations of pre-electric nighttime workers who became, over time, creatures of the dark by professional adaptation, habituated to working by firelight, to sleeping in the afternoon when others were active, to experiencing the night as a working environment rather than a resting one. The bakehouse fire, maintained through the night in a city where all other fires were supposed to be banked or extinguished, was itself a source of concern. The curfew regulations that required hearth fires to be covered at night had exceptions for professional bakers, and the Great Fire of London that began in a bakery on Pudding Lane was not the first time a professional baker's nighttime fire had become a civic problem. The printing trade from Gutenberg's mid-15th century through the 19th century was organised around press runs that often extended through the night, particularly for newspapers that needed to be available at the start of the business day. The compositors who set type by candlelight, the pressmen who operated the printing presses through the night hours, the runners who would carry the printed sheets from the press room to the distributors in the pre-dawn hours. These were people of the night in an industry that lived or died by the morning deadline. The connection between printing news and the night was structural. News had to be printed in time to be read at the beginning of the day, which required the printing to happen during the night, which meant the newspaper was always, in some fundamental sense, a document of the dark hours, assembled in the dark by people working in candlelight or gaslight, for consumption in the daylight, that the press workers would sleep through. The fishing industry, in its inshore and harbour forms, had its own specific relationship to the pre-electric night that was determined by tidal rhythms and the behaviour of the fish themselves. Certain fish are more catchable at night. Certain tidal conditions that favour fishing occur at night. Certain harbour approaches are safer at certain states of the tide that may fall at night. Fishermen who worked at night developed the same acoustic and tactile skills for navigating darkness that other pre-electric nighttime workers developed, with the addition of the specific skill of reading water in darkness, interpreting the sound of waves, the feel of the wind, the smell of the air, the behaviour of the boat under their feet, in ways that produced information about position and conditions that the absence of visual input required them to access through other channels. The relationship between alcohol and pre-electric night requires careful handling, because it is complicated in ways that modern interpretations sometimes simplify. The tavern, the alehouse, and the inn were not only, or even primarily, social spaces for evening entertainment. They were, in many practical respects, the only adequately lit and heated spaces available to large portions of the urban poor population during the night hours. A labourer's room, if he had a room, might be inadequately heated and lit by a single rushlight or small candle. The tavern was heated, lit, and full of people. Three qualities that had specific value in the dark cold of a pre-electric evening. The cost of a pint of ale bought you, along with the ale, access to warmth, light, and the specific comfort of being in a space that was occupied by other humans, and therefore was not the terrifying isolated dark. This is not a defense of the drinking culture of pre-electric societies. The quantity of alcohol consumed was a genuine public health problem, whose consequences are documented extensively in the historical record. It is a context for understanding why the tavern was so central to nighttime social life, in ways that cannot be reduced simply to a love of drinking. The connection between dark environments and alcohol consumption. The finding that people drink more in dimly lit environments is documented in modern behavioural psychology research and attributed to the disinhibiting effect of reduced visual social monitoring. You do what you would not do if you felt watched. The pre-electric tavern, which was not brightly lit by any standard, would have combined the social availability of alcohol with the psychological environment most conducive to its consumption. Officially, people went to the tavern for companionship and refreshment. Unofficially, people went to the tavern because it was the only warm, lit place they had access to. And they stayed longer than intended, because the dark outside was not a compelling alternative. The specific culture of the tavern as a nighttime institution also generated specific nighttime crimes, which pre-electric city records document with a regularity that suggests the pattern was entirely predictable to contemporary observers, even if it resisted all efforts to change it. Fights that started in taverns and moved into the dark street. Robberies of people leaving taverns in impaired states. The particular category of person who drank until they could not navigate the dark, and was found in the morning in the condition that the historical record describes, with varying degrees of euphemism, as having taken too much drink and laid himself down in the street. The Night Watch's responsibility for managing the outcomes of tavern culture was a significant portion of their actual workload, as opposed to the dramatic crime, stopping that the institution was nominally organised around. The political economy of street lighting, who paid for it, who resisted it, and why, is one of the more illuminating windows into pre-electric urban governance. Systematic street lighting required capital investment and ongoing maintenance costs. Both had to come from somewhere. The early systems in Paris and London were funded through various mechanisms that combined ratepayer levies, government subsidies, and private contracting arrangements. The private contractor model, in which a company was paid a fixed sum to maintain a specified number of lamps on specified streets, was particularly common in English cities, and had the specific failure modes you would expect. Contractors who maintained the lights on the streets where inspection was most likely and neglected the streets where it was not, lights that were lit on the nights when the contract specified they be lit and not on others. Disputes about what adequate maintenance meant in contractual terms that were resolved in favour of whoever had the better lawyers. The resistance to street lighting came from multiple directions and was not entirely irrational. Property owners who were assessed for street lighting costs in front of their properties objected to paying for a service whose benefits were distributed across the neighbourhood. Residents of well-lit streets argued that their fees were subsidizing the unlit streets of their neighbors. The owners of the link, boy trade, and the oil lamp supply industry had obvious economic interests in the maintenance of darkness, or at least in the maintenance of the specific kind of darkness that required their particular solution. And there was a more general social conservatism that expressed itself as resistance to nighttime public activity, on the grounds that nothing good happened when people were out after dark, and making it easier to be out after dark would simply enable more of the nothing good. This argument, that better street lighting would increase the amount of nocturnal activity, and that increased nocturnal activity was a social risk rather than a social benefit, was made repeatedly in debates about street lighting improvement in British, French, and German cities through the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was not entirely wrong in its empirical premise. Better lighting did increase nighttime activity. The increase in nighttime activity did include crime and disorder, because crime and disorder are a component of any human activity, and the nighttime versions simply became more visible rather than more prevalent. But the increase also included commerce, socializing, cultural activity, and the specific freedom of movement through public space that darkness had previously denied to everyone who could not afford a private link, boy, or carriage. The politics of who deserved to move through the night safely was, underneath the sanitation and crime arguments, a politics of class and gender. Women in pre-electric cities existed in a particularly constrained nighttime geography. The night street was, by cultural convention, and to a significant degree by physical reality, male space. Or more precisely, it was space in which unaccompanied women were subject to a specific range of assumptions and risks that men were not. An unaccompanied woman on the street at night was, in the social taxonomy of pre-electric urban culture, a sex worker until proven otherwise, and the proof was not always accepted. This was not simply prejudice, though it was certainly that. It was also a reflection of the fact that the categories of women who moved through pre-electric city streets at night were constrained by the same economic and domestic circumstances that kept most women off the streets at night: domestic servants who were in their employers' houses, wives and daughters of craftsmen and labourers who were in their households after dark, respectable women of any class who did not go out at night unaccompanied by a man. The women who were on the street at night unaccompanied were, in this taxonomy, the women who had no household to be in, which was indeed a category that included many sex workers, but also included women who were working late, women who were travelling, women who had been turned out of their lodgings, and women who simply had legitimate reasons to be in the street that the social taxonomy did not accommodate. The specific vulnerability of women in the pre-electric dark was not only about sexual violence, though sexual violence was a real risk. It was also about the general vulnerability that comes from being in an environment where your social categorization determines how you are treated, and where the social categorization assigned to unaccompanied women in dark streets was disadvantageous, regardless of actual circumstances. Better street lighting reduced this vulnerability in concrete ways. You could be seen more clearly as an individual rather than as a silhouette category. Your occupation, your clothing, your apparent social station became visible. The specific anonymity of darkness that was advantageous to criminals was also disadvantageous to anyone whose safety depended on being correctly identified, which included women navigating streets where incorrect identification was dangerous. The gaslight era, beginning in the first decade of the 19th century and spreading through European cities across the following several decades, was not simply a continuation of oil lamp street lighting at a higher intensity. It was a qualitative change in what nighttime urban life was possible. Gas lamps were significantly brighter than oil lamps, not because the combustion chemistry was fundamentally different. Gas, like oil, was burning hydrocarbon compounds, but because the gas supply was continuous through a pipe rather than finite in a reservoir, and because the flame could be configured in ways that maximized light output without the constraints of wick management. A well-designed gas lamp was approximately equivalent in light output to 12 to 15 candles, enough to illuminate not just the lamp's immediate vicinity, but the road surface for a substantial distance in both directions. Under gas lighting, nighttime street visibility in lit areas approached something that a person accustomed only to candlelight and oil lamps would have found genuinely startling. The social effects of gas lighting were immediate and observable. Shops in gaslit areas extended their hours. Theatres and other entertainment venues that had previously closed before dark could now operate into the evening. Promenading, walking through public streets for pleasure rather than for purpose, became a feature of evening culture in gaslit commercial districts in ways that it had never been possible before. The gaslit street was a new kind of public space, a nighttime extension of the daytime commercial and social world that darkness had previously curtailed. And like every new public space, it attracted the full range of human activities, the improving and the entertaining, and the commercial and the illicit, and the merely pleasurable, in proportions that reflected the full range of what people would do when given the opportunity. The resistance of gas lighting to the darkness was not complete. Gaslit streets existed within cities that were still largely dark. The gaslit commercial district of a major city like London or Paris or Hamburg occupied a specific geographic area that gave way, at its edges, to the oil lamp streets of less prosperous neighbourhoods, which gave way in turn to the darkness of residential streets, with no public lighting at all. The gaslight made the geography of privilege in the pre-electric city legible, in a new way. Where the gas lamps ended, and the darkness began, was a line on the map of the city that also marked the line between the areas whose commercial activity justified the infrastructure investment and the areas whose commercial activity did not, which was, not coincidentally, roughly the same line as the boundary between the neighbourhoods that mattered to the city government and the neighbourhoods that did not. The night was not a universal experience. Different societies in different climates and with different resources constructed the pre-electric dark differently. In China, the management of urban nighttime had a long administrative history that developed its own specific institutions. The curfew system of Tang Dynasty Chang'an, one of the largest cities in the world in the 8th and 9th centuries CE, with a population that may have reached 1 million, divided the city into wards, each enclosed by walls, that were locked at night. The drum beat that signalled curfew was the signal for all residents to be inside their ward, and for the ward gates to close. Movement between wards after curfew required official authorization. Patrols within wards were responsible for maintaining order in their specific area and reporting fires. The system was not primarily organized around fear of the dark as a supernatural environment. The Chinese nighttime folklore was different in emphasis from the European, though it contained its own rich tradition of night creatures and malevolent spirits, but around the political and administrative concern with controlling the movement of people in ways that the daylight city, with its crowds and commerce, made impossible. The night was when the administration could know where everyone was, because the administration had arranged things so that everyone was inside their ward. The ward gates of Tang Dynasty Chang'an were opened again at dawn, with a drum beat that served the same function as the curfew drum, in reverse. Between these two drum beats, the city was organized by the administration's preferred architecture rather than by the spontaneous preferences of its inhabitants. The nighttime enforcement was not always or everywhere rigorous. Chang'an's ward system was certainly not perfectly observed, as court cases involving violations suggest. But the institutional aspiration was clear. The night was the time when the city became legible to its administrators, and legibility was the point. The Islamic tradition had its own specific relationship to the night through the institution of night prayer. The Isha prayer, the fifth and final of the daily prayers, performed after nightfall, and the pre-dawn prayer, the Fajr, which required waking before dawn. The muezzin's call to prayer from the minaret of the mosque served the same function in Islamic cities that the monastery bell served in Christian ones. It marked the hours of the night, confirmed the passage of time, and provided an acoustic structure for the dark. In a city of mud brick and narrow streets, the muezzin's voice carried in the night in a way that the narrow streets and ambient noise of daytime would have prevented, and the call at night had a specific quality of both urgency and comfort that the daytime calls, competing with the noise of the bazaar, did not produce in quite the same way. The specific challenge of Ramadan, the Islamic month of fasting during daylight hours, created a nighttime culture in Muslim societies that had no equivalent elsewhere. During Ramadan, the rhythm of eating reversed. The meal before dawn, the suhoor, required preparation and consumption in darkness, and the iftar meal at sunset began the evening's main social activity. Cities during Ramadan extended their nighttime activity beyond what was normal in other months. Markets opened after iftar, social visiting continued late into the night, and the combination of eating, socializing, and prayer in the night hours created an urban environment that was specifically and deliberately more alive after dark than before. The Ramadan cannon, fired at sunset to signal iftar, and before dawn to signal the end of suhoor, was a specifically nighttime institution, the sound of the cannon in the dark, confirming the specific moment that defined the day's schedule. was the primary public timekeeping technology for Ramadan observance in cities that had not yet developed public clock infrastructure, which is most of them for most of the relevant period. The night canon said now, it said this twice a day, with enough force to be heard across the city, and the twice daily announcement that the specific moment had arrived was what the city organized itself around. The night at sea was a different kind of darkness, with its own specific terrors. Navigating by night at sea in the pre-electronic era required the stars when the stars were available, and something close to improvised dead reckoning when they were not. The night watch on a sailing vessel was organized around the continuous tasks of navigation, sail adjustment, and weather observation that a vessel in motion at sea required around the clock. The sailor on night watch was not in the dark, in the way that the person standing in a pre-electric city street was in the dark. The sailor was on a surface surrounded by moving water, in a vessel that required constant active management, in an environment where a storm could arrive faster than response was possible, and where the darkness made every navigation decision more dangerous than its daylight equivalent. Running lights, the specific coloured lanterns that vessels used to signal their presence and heading to other vessels, were adopted precisely because the darkness of the ocean at night created the specific danger of collision between vessels that could not see each other. A red light on the port, left side, a green light on the starboard, right side, a white light at the stern. This system, which is now standardized internationally and encoded in maritime law, emerged from centuries of ships colliding in the dark because neither could see the other. And the response to that problem was not more light generally but specific signal lights that communicated directional information in a code that could be read at distance in darkness. The running light system is one of the more elegant solutions to a darkness problem in maritime history. It does not try to illuminate the darkness. It encodes specific information in light that can be read against the darkness. Lighthouses were the other maritime response to darkness, and their history is a story of the specific ways that the darkness of coastlines killed ships, and the specific effort required to prevent it. Coastlines at night were deadly to ships navigating without adequate charts or landmark information. A coastline that was navigable in daylight, where the headland could be seen, where the rocks were visible, where the harbour entrance was identifiable by its visual features, became a death trap at night, when none of those visual features were accessible. Wrecks on coastlines at night were a regular feature of maritime history across every seafaring culture. The Goodwin Sands off the Kent coast of England was sometimes called the Ship Swallower, a sandbar that was navigable at certain tidal states and death at others, invisible at night, responsible for hundreds of wrecks over the centuries. The systematic lighthouse network that now covers most developed coastlines was constructed slowly, expensively, and in the face of significant resistance from interests that found the wrecks economically productive. Wrecking, the salvage of cargo from wrecked vessels, was a recognized industry in coastal communities. A coastline that regularly produced wrecked ships carrying cargo was a coastline whose local population had a specific economic interest in wrecks continuing to occur, which produced the specific pattern of behaviour that maritime folklore calls deliberately luring ships onto rocks with false lights. A practice documented often enough that it became a legal matter, though whether it was as common as folklore suggests, or whether the folklore reflects coastal communities' interest in the dramatic over the merely profitable, is a matter of ongoing historical argument. What is certain is that the construction of reliable lighthouse infrastructure required overcoming both the engineering challenges of maintaining a light on an exposed coastal site through all weather conditions and the political and economic opposition of interests that were not enthusiastic about fewer wrecks. The lighthouse keeper became, in the 19th century, a specific icon of isolated nocturnal duty, a person living alone or with a small family in a remote site, responsible for maintaining a light through every night, in every weather, for as long as it took before the relief vessel arrived. The lighthouse keeper's log, kept meticulously through all conditions, records the specific nighttime experience of isolated coast in darkness, the particular sounds of specific weather conditions, the birds that struck the glass at night, the ships that passed without incident, the ships that did not. The underground had its own relationship to darkness that was different from all of these. Not the darkness of night, but the darkness of depth, a darkness that existed regardless of time, and that the people who worked in it had to manage through artificial light at all hours. Mining was a nighttime industry in the literal sense, that the miners worked in perpetual night regardless of the hour. The mines of Cornwall and Wales, of the Ruhr and Silesia, of the coalfields of northern England. These were environments of absolute darkness, broken only by the candles and oil lamps that the miners carried. The specific lighting requirements of mining were different from surface lighting, because the environment was more enclosed, because the gases produced by the earth created additional fire risks, and because the stakes of a lighting failure were higher than the inconvenience of darkness. A miner who lost his light in the mine was in a specific kind of trouble that surfaced darkness. However dark, did not replicate. The Davy lamp, invented by Humphrey Davy in 1815, as a response to the recurring catastrophe of mining explosions caused by flame contact with methane gas, was one of the first safety devices designed specifically for the management of light in dangerous conditions. The lamp enclosed the flame in a wire gauze that prevented the flame from propagating into the surrounding atmosphere. The gauze cooled the combustion products enough that they could not ignite the surrounding methane. The Davy lamp allowed miners to take fire into gas-rich environments for the first time without the specific risk of immediate explosion. This was not quite as good as it sounds. The Davy lamp gave miners confidence to go deeper and work in conditions where the gas concentration was higher, which made the overall risk profile more complex rather than simply safer. But it addressed a specific problem of light in darkness that had been killing miners regularly, and the solution was elegant enough to still be celebrated as a triumph of applied chemistry. The miners' experience of the night, not the night above ground, but the perpetual night underground, produced its own culture and its own specific relationship to light. Miners celebrated the end of the shift by emerging into daylight with a vividness that people who had not spent the previous 8 hours in absolute darkness might not fully appreciate. The light at the top of the mine shaft, which marked the return from the underground night to the surface world, was a daily resurrection that miners understood as both physically significant and, for many, spiritually resonant. You had been in the dark. Now you were in the light. The experience that most people had once a day, in the transition from sleep to morning, miners had at the end of every shift, and they experienced it with an intensity that the ordinary morning does not produce. Surgery at night, in the pre-anesthetic and pre-electric era, was something that surgeons avoided unless the alternative was immediate death. The reasons were primarily visual. Surgery requires seeing what you are doing, and the seeing what you are doing under candlelight or oil lamp, with the specific shadows and color distortions that fire-based light sources produce, was considerably more difficult than doing the same procedures in daylight. The color of blood and tissue, which carries diagnostic information that surgeons use to make decisions during operations, looks different in firelight than in daylight. Wounds that might be clearly identifiable and manageable in good natural light became ambiguous and difficult to assess in the flickering shadow of a candle. The risk of error increased. The risk of performing a procedure that was not indicated, or failing to identify a complication that was developing, was higher in the dark than in daylight. Emergency surgery at night happened because emergencies did not schedule themselves for convenient daylight hours. Battlefields generated surgical work through the night following a day's fighting. The military surgeons who performed amputations and extractions by lantern light in field hospitals after major engagements were operating under conditions that they understood to be dangerous, but that were the only conditions available. The civilian equivalent, the surgeon called to a difficult birth, a strangulated hernia, a severe trauma, managed nighttime operations as best as the available light allowed, which was not very well, but better than not operating at all. The specific problem of childbirth at night was one of the most common medical emergencies of the pre-electric world, and it happened at night more often than any distributional logic would predict, because the labor process frequently began at night and progressed through darkness to a dawn delivery, or began in the afternoon and reached its most critical stages in the hours after midnight. The midwife called to a difficult nighttime birth navigated the dark streets to the house, worked by candlelight in a room full of anxious family members, made decisions about intervention that required visual assessment of conditions that were not well lit, and managed whatever complication had arisen with the tools and knowledge she had. No anesthesia, no surgical option beyond the most extreme emergencies, no blood supply, no way to call for help that would arrive quickly. That the infant and maternal mortality rates of the pre-electric world were high is a statement that explains nothing about what it actually meant to be the midwife at 2 a.m. by candlelight, or to be the woman in labor in the dark, or to be the family waiting outside the door. The specific sensory experience of going to sleep in a pre-electric household, the actual physical moment-to-moment process, was different from the modern experience in ways that are worth attending to. You would have begun to wind down earlier. The rhythm of the pre-electric household was organized around daylight. You rose with the light, or shortly after. You worked and moved through the hours that light permitted. And as the day ended, the world contracted around the available artificial light, which was typically one candle or one small oil lamp in the main room of the house. The household gathered around this single light source in the evening hours. This is the physical origin of the word hearth, as the centre of family life, because the hearth fire was not just heat but light, and the family gathered around it because it was the only light there was. The evening hours gathered around the single candle, or the fire, produced a specific kind of social intimacy that the modern experience of multiple independently lit rooms has replaced with a different and more private mode of living. Then the candle was extinguished, or more accurately, the candle was allowed to burn down to a stub too small to continue safely, and the stub was carefully saved because wax or tallow was not wasted, and the room became dark, not dim. Dark. The shift from candlelight to no candlelight was not a gradual dimming, but a sudden cessation, after which the room was only as lit as the window glass allowed, from whatever ambient sky brightness existed outside, which, on a moonless clouded night, was nothing. You went to bed in this darkness. You lay in bed in this darkness. If you woke in the night, as you likely did, in the long hours between first and second sleep, you woke in this darkness, and you did whatever you did in the interval between sleeps in this darkness, navigating by memory and touch in the space that you knew well enough to move through without injury, because you had lived there long enough to have its physical layout memorized. The darkness was not special. It was the default condition of every night. You had been born into it, and would die in it, and everything in between had happened, in significant measure, in it. This is the thing that the modern experience of pre-electric night, constructed from documentary evidence and historical imagination, can reconstruct intellectually, but cannot fully reproduce. The extent to which darkness was simply ordinary, not dramatic, not exceptional, just what the night was, every night, forever, until it wasn't. Dim the lights, sleep well. The candle is already out. The economics of fear in the pre-electric world were different from the economics of fear now. Fear cost time, and time was already expensive. Every diversion from the efficient path, every route taken around the darker lane, every decision to wait until morning, every hiring of a boy to escort you through the streets, was a tax on daily life levied by the darkness. The wealthy paid this tax in cash and considered it the cost of civilization. The poor paid it in exposure, because they could not afford the escort and could not avoid the dark lane, and the dark lane was the lane they lived on. The neighborhood watch system that developed in medieval and early modern European cities was, at its foundation, an acknowledgement that darkness was a collective problem requiring a collective solution. The parish watch, the obligation of male householders to take turns, standing watch in the streets at night, was not voluntary charity. It was a compulsory service, organized by the civic authorities, enforced by fines for non-performance, and understood by everyone involved as a necessary measure, rather than an admirable one. The men who walked the night streets of 15th century London or 16th century Paris or 17th century Amsterdam were not doing so because they wanted to. They were doing so because the alternative was to leave the streets unwatched, which was a problem for everyone, including themselves. The watchman's equipment varied by era and location, but was generally minimal: a lantern, a staff or halberd, a horn or rattle for raising alarm, and whatever natural senses he had. The night watchman's job was not to fight crime, it was to notice crime and make noise. A single watchman encountering a group of determined thieves was not expected to prevail physically. He was expected to shout, blow his horn, rattle his rattle, and wake up enough of the surrounding neighborhood that the thieves would prefer to flee rather than continue. This was not always effective, but it was the theory, and the theory had the virtue of not requiring the watchman to be brave. The signals that pre-electric night watchmen used to communicate, the specific calls that meant fire versus all's well, versus get out of your house now, varied by city and were essentially local languages of emergency that residents had to learn or risk ignoring the wrong alarm. In some German cities, the watchman sang his rounds, a sung announcement of the time, the state of the weather, and the assessment that the streets were clear. The singing watchman was not musical theatre. The singing was functional, because a voice travelling down a dark stone street at 2 in the morning carries further than a spoken announcement and is more likely to penetrate closed shutters and the sleep of the exhausted. The tune also made the announcement recognisable as a watchman's call rather than random noise in the street, which was a distinction that mattered. The relationship between pre-electric communities and the natural world of night was more intimate than the modern relationship by necessity, rather than sentiment. Before electric light allowed the indoor environment to be made entirely independent of outdoor conditions, people knew the moon in the way that modern urban dwellers do not as a romantic backdrop, but as a practical variable. You knew the phase of the moon the way you knew the weather forecast, because it determined what was and was not possible that night. A full moon in the 2 weeks around its peak gave enough light to move confidently, to recognize faces, to travel roads you knew, to do outdoor work if the work was coarse enough not to require fine discrimination. The moon was not a substitute for daylight. It was a different category of light, sufficient for some purposes and insufficient for others, whose availability you planned around. The almanac, the annual publication that predicted lunar phases, tidal patterns, sunrise and sunset times, and other celestial regularities, was one of the most widely purchased publications in pre-electric Europe and America, competing only with the Bible for household distribution. Its practical function was navigation through time, knowing when the light would be available and planning accordingly. A farmer deciding when to schedule a distant market trip would consult the lunar calendar, not because he was superstitious, but because travelling to a market in moonlight was qualitatively different from travelling in new moon dark, and the difference was worth planning around. The almanac sold because darkness was a scheduling constraint, and scheduling around it required information. The moon's effect on nocturnal animal behaviour added an additional layer of meaning to lunar cycles for communities that kept livestock or depended on agriculture. Predators were more active on moonlit nights, or perhaps more accurately, they were more visible on moonlit nights, and the attacks that occurred on moonlit nights were more likely to be witnessed and reported, creating a bias in folk memory toward associating moon phases with danger. Whether foxes and wolves were actually more active when the moon was bright is a question of ecology. That people believed they were, and adjusted their behaviour accordingly, is a question of history. The practical response was the same regardless of the truth. Extra vigilance around the flock on moonlit nights, additional checks of the barn, a heightened alertness that was calibrated to a world where the sky itself was a variable in the risk calculation. City dwellers in the pre-electric era experienced the moon differently from rural dwellers, because the city imposed its own additional layer of light management on top of the natural cycle. In a city with regular street lantern service, the full moon was less transformative than it was in the countryside. You already had some navigation light, and adding moonlight to it was a marginal improvement rather than a categorical shift. The cities that scheduled their official lantern service around the lunar calendar, extinguishing lanterns on nights when the moon was full or nearly full, on the theory that the moon provided sufficient light and the fuel expense was unnecessary, were making a rational economic calculation. But they were also producing a predictable vulnerability on the nights when cloud cover obscured the moon that was supposed to be doing the work. The relationship between official light provision, natural light availability, and the actual experience of safety in the streets was a dynamic that pre-electric city administrators managed imperfectly and argued about extensively in council records that survived to tell us what the debates were about. The sound of pre-electric night was different from the sound of modern night, in ways that are almost impossible to reconstruct, without actually experiencing the absence of the baseline drone of electric civilization. The refrigerator hum, the HVAC fan, the distant traffic on the arterial road, the server room in the building 3 blocks away. All of these contribute to the floor of ambient noise below which modern urban environments do not fall. Pre-electric night, particularly in rural or small-town settings, could fall essentially to silence, the specific silence in which your own breathing is audible, in which the creak of the house as it contracts in cooling air is startling, in which a dog barking half a mile away is clearly distinguishable and localizable. Humans are capable of detecting sound in this environment that they cannot detect above the modern ambient noise floor. People who lived in pre-electric environments had a level of auditory environmental awareness that modern urban dwellers have mostly lost, because they had to. The sounds of pre-electric night were the sounds of pre-electric night specifically. The watchman's call, the distant church bell, the sound of a horse on cobblestones, the particular acoustics of a city or village in which the absence of motor vehicles meant that human voices and animal sounds travelled without competition. The person lying awake in a pre-electric house heard, through the walls, what was happening in the street in a way that was both an imposition and an information service. You knew, from the sound of footsteps, whether the person outside was moving quickly or slowly, whether they were alone or with others, whether they were in trouble or going about normal business. You knew whether the watchman had just passed, because you had heard his call. You knew the time within perhaps a quarter hour because you could hear the church bells. The acoustic information provided by the pre-electric night was rich, specific, and integrated into daily awareness in a way that the modern acoustic environment, with its noise floor and its continuous background, does not permit. The political history of street lighting is a history of who had the authority to require other people to provide light at their own expense. The early street lantern ordinances in Paris, London, and Amsterdam were not requests. They were mandates. Householders on certain streets were legally required to hang a lantern outside their door during specified nighttime hours, under penalty of fine. The enforcement of these ordinances was uneven, which is to say that it was largely absent in poor neighbourhoods, where the fines could not be collected, and largely present in wealthy neighbourhoods, where the civic administration had stronger relationships with the residents. The darkness of poor neighbourhoods was accordingly more complete and more consistent than the darkness of wealthy ones, which is a pattern that holds across the long history of urban illumination, with a regularity that is not coincidental. The transition from mandatory private lanterns to publicly funded street lighting was a significant shift in the political theory of public space. A private lantern requirement said individuals are responsible for illuminating their own portion of the public street. A publicly funded street lamp said the city is responsible for illuminating its streets, and this responsibility is a collective one funded by taxation. The debate between these two positions, which played out in city councils across Europe through the 17th and 18th centuries, was not only about the most efficient way to light a street. It was a debate about whether the city's common spaces were private responsibilities managed through regulation or collective goods managed through public provision. The advocates for public lighting were, in a specific sense, advocates for a more expansive theory of the public good. The advocates for keeping the obligation private were, in a specific sense, advocates for a more minimal theory of government responsibility. The darkness was a policy question. The insurance industry, which in its modern form began in London in the coffee houses of the late 17th century, Lloyd's Coffee House on Tower Street, where merchants gathered to share risk and price it, being the canonical origin story, was constituted in part by the risk of fire in conditions of darkness. The fire risk that drove Lloyd's early underwriting was not primarily the risk of industrial accident. It was the risk of domestic fire, the candle left burning, the hearth improperly damped, the tallow lamp that tipped onto the straw floor covering while the household slept. These were darkness-mediated risks. They occurred because light management was difficult and imperfect, and the consequences of mismanaging it were catastrophic. The premiums that Lloyd's early underwriters charged were, in a very direct sense, a price placed on the darkness, on the probability that pre-electric light management would fail in a way that consumed the insured property. The fire insurance brigades that developed alongside the insurance industry, private firefighting forces maintained by insurance companies, and deployed only to fight fires in insured properties, created a darkly comic dynamic in pre-electric cities. Multiple private brigades arriving at a burning building, checking the fire mark, the metal plaque on the building's exterior identifying its insurer, and the brigades, without a contract with that insurer, departing without fighting the fire, while the brigade with the right contract attempted to manage the situation. The system was spectacularly inefficient in obvious ways, but it was also, in its bizarre logic, a legible expression of the pre-electric city's relationship with risk, distributed, privatized, and organized around the specific calculus of who bore responsibility for managing what. The vocabulary of light and darkness in pre-electric European languages carries the weight of centuries of lived experience in ways that have become invisible through familiarity. Enlightenment, the intellectual movement, the philosophical project, the rejection of superstition and tradition in favor of reason and evidence, chose its metaphor from the most practically significant transformation in human life that the people using it could imagine. The philosophers of the Enlightenment were not being poetic when they called their project a bringing of light into darkness. They were using the most powerful available image for the transformation they believed they were achieving, the replacement of the darkness of ignorance with the light of reason, in a world where the darkness of ignorance and the darkness of actual night were both lived realities, that their audience understood from daily experience. The word lucid, meaning clear, rational, comprehensible, shares a root with lux, the Latin word for light. The word illustrious means, at its etymological root, shining upon. The word brilliant comes from the Old French for sparkling or glittering. The language of intellectual excellence in Western European tradition is saturated with light metaphors that made, at the time they were coined, immediate sensory sense. To understand something was to see it, and seeing required light, and light was scarce and precious, and not to be taken for granted. The modern reader encounters these metaphors as figures of speech. The medieval, or early modern reader encountered them as observations. The theological significance of light in the Christian tradition. God is light. In him there is no darkness at all. 1 John 1-5, the light of the world, the candles at Mass, the illuminated manuscripts, the stained glass windows designed to flood the nave with coloured light, was not purely abstract. It was enacted in a world where controlling light was a significant technical achievement, and where the church was one of the few institutions that could afford to do it lavishly. A cathedral with adequate candles burning was a demonstration of wealth organisation and divine favour in an era when adequate light was genuinely difficult to maintain. The darkness outside the cathedral windows was real and daily. The light inside the cathedral was extraordinary and expensive, and the theological claim that God was on the side of the light had a material dimension that the theology, as purely abstract, proposition reading misses. The street food culture of pre-electric cities was organised partly around the logic of light. The vendors who could work in daylight worked in daylight. The vendors who worked at night were serving a specific night market. The drinkers leaving the taverns, the workers on night trades, the travellers who had arrived late and not yet eaten, and their night operation was enabled by the portable fire of their brazier or cook stove, which produced both the heat to cook and the light to see by. The chestnut vendor, roasting over an open coal fire at the street corner, the sausage seller, working over a small grill, the hot drink vendor, with a pot of whatever was fashionable, coffee in the 18th century, various herbal preparations before that. All of these figures were visible in the night streets, partly because their cooking fires announced them to the surrounding darkness, with both smell and light. They were, incidentally, also providing light for the people gathered around them, which was a social function of communal fire that extended from the prehistoric campfire through the pre-electric street corner without interruption. The colour of pre-electric light was different from the colour of modern light, in ways that affected how people perceived their visual world. Candlelight and firelight are warm in colour temperature, approximately 1500-2000 Kelvin, compared to the 5500-6500 Kelvin of natural daylight, and the 4000-5000 Kelvin of modern cool, white lead lighting. The effect of this colour difference is that everything seen by candlelight or firelight appears in a warmer, yellower, redder register than the same object seen in daylight. Blues appear muted or nearly invisible. Reds appear vivid and dramatic. Skin tones appear, depending on the viewer's preferences, either more flattering or more alarming. The visual world of the pre-electric night, for those who had any light at all, was a world of warm tones and deep shadows, in which the specific visual information that cool temperature daylight reveals. The precise shade of blue in a garment, the green of vegetations, the cool grey of stone, was replaced by the warmer and more dramatic chromatic language of firelight. Painters who worked by candlelight were aware of this, and the best of them developed techniques to compensate for the colour shift, knowing that the painting they were creating by firelight would be viewed in daylight, and the colours they saw would not be the colours the viewer saw. The anecdote, probably apocryphal, that great masters kept windows uncurtained even in winter to get natural light for fine colour work, reflects the real underlying problem. Artificial light was not only dimmer than natural light, it was chromatically different, in ways that made precise colour matching impossible. The tonal richness of Rembrandt's night scenes and candlelit interiors, the specific quality that makes them look like night and candlelight rather than like daylight captured in a dark room, is the product of an artist who understood, from daily experience, what firelight actually did to the visual world. The process of making and maintaining fire in the pre-electric world was itself a significant daily labour, whose invisibility in the historical record reflects not its unimportance, but its universality. Someone lit the fire every morning. Someone fed it through the day. Someone managed its extinction at night, in a way that preserved enough ember to restart it in the morning without the labour of starting from scratch. The flint and steel that produced fire from scratch. striking a shower of sparks onto tinder, nurturing the spark to a small flame. Transferring the flame to kindling was a skill that the pre-electric householder knew as intimately as the modern householder knows the operation of the stove igniter, but the skill took longer to execute, and the consequences of failure were more significant, because failure meant cold and dark, rather than just a delayed cup of tea. The emotional geography of pre-electric night was not uniform across the population. The experience of darkness was mediated by class, by occupation, by the physical layout of one's living situation, by whether one shared a bed with others or slept alone, by whether one's windows opened onto a street or a courtyard, by whether the neighborhood had any street lanterns or none. The rich man sleeping in his bedroom in the fashionable part of town, with shuttered windows against the street, a banked fire in the hearth, and servants whose job included overnight watch. His night was different from the night of the laborer sleeping in a room shared with 4 other people in a building, without shutters, with the street immediately outside, and no fire. Both were pre-electric. They were not the same night. The children of the pre-electric world grew up with a specific developmental relationship to darkness that the modern child, growing up with nightlights and hallway, LEDs, and the ambient glow of screens, does not share. Pre-electric childhood introduced darkness as a basic condition of existence, early and completely. When the candle went out, the dark was total, and you were expected to manage that. The fears that children reported, the thing under the bed, the shape in the corner, the sound on the stairs, were fears calibrated to an environment in which the thing under the bed could not be immediately disproved by turning on the light, because there was no light to turn on. You had to wait. Either the fear resolved by your own nervous system convincing itself that the sound was the house settling, or it resolved by morning, when the darkness lifted and the thing under the bed turned out to be the shadow of a chamber pot. Or, in some cases, that the child would remember for the rest of their life. It did not resolve cleanly, because the night genuinely contained things worth fearing, and a child's nervous system in the pre-electric dark was sometimes correctly calibrated to its environment. The literature of childhood in the pre-electric world, the fairy tales, the cautionary stories, the nursery rhymes that have been so thoroughly sanitized in modern retellings that their original function is barely visible, was largely organized around teaching children the correct behavioral responses to darkness. Don't go into the forest at night. Don't open the door after dark. Don't follow the light you see in the meadow. The moral content of these stories was not arbitrary. It was a curriculum designed to instill, in children who would actually face these situations, the habits of mind and behavior that would minimize their chances of dying in a ditch. The wolf in the forest was a wolf. The stranger who came to the door after dark was statistically more dangerous than the stranger who came during daylight. The light in the meadow was, with some frequency, actual will. Oh, the wisp over actual marshy ground over which the following child would sink. The fairy tale was a risk communication tool before it was an entertainment. The pre-electric night also shaped the architecture of domestic space in ways that are still visible in old buildings if you know what to look at. The hearth as the physical center of the main room, the fireplace around which the principal room was organized, is a feature of pre-electric domestic architecture that reflects the function of the hearth as the room's primary light source, as well as its heat source. Remove the hearth and you remove the reason for the room's organization. The modern living room, organized around a television that provides its own light, is the same functional logic applied to a different technology. The great hall of a medieval manor house, with its central fire, was not only a heating solution, it was a light management solution, concentrating the available light in the largest space where the most people gathered. The bedroom, the specific private sleeping room separate from the main living space, is partly a luxury that became available as artificial light allowed domestic spaces to be differentiated by function. In a one-room dwelling, everybody slept where they lived, because there was no point in having a separate dark room for sleeping in a world where all rooms were dark once the fire went out. The elaboration of the sleeping chamber as a separate private space correlates, in European domestic architecture, with the period of increased artificial light availability. When it became possible to illuminate separate rooms, it became possible to have separate rooms dedicated to activities that required privacy and quiet. The specific ritual of putting the household to bed in the pre-electric world was a sequence of light management decisions that ended with darkness as the destination. You banked the fire, adjusting the coals or embers to a configuration that would hold heat through the night without risk of sparking, covering it with ash to slow the burn. You ensured that no candles were burning unattended. You checked the kitchen fire if there was a separate kitchen. You went through the house with a candle, performing the final check, and then you extinguished the candle. The procedure was so universal, so repeated every night of every life, that it generated a specific vocabulary to bank the fire, to snuff the candle, to damp the hearth. These phrases are still in the language used metaphorically, disconnected from the physical procedure they once described. To bank your fires, to manage your resources carefully for the long duration, made sensory sense to anyone who had ever managed a pre-electric household. The morning reversal of this procedure, the relighting of the household fire from whatever ember survived the night, the rekindling of the kitchen hearth, the first candle of the day was the daily reinstitution of light as a managed condition. It was not automatic. It required attention and skill, and in the coldest winter mornings, a physical determination to leave the warmth of the bed and crouch at a cold hearth and coax a spark back into flame before the household could begin functioning. The person who performed this function, typically in European domestic arrangements, the first servant up, or the housewife in households without servants, was the person on whom the transition from pre-electric darkness to pre-electric light actually depended. The phrase "to keep the home fires burning" was not a metaphor in origin. It was a description of a technical responsibility that was literally existential for the household. The specific fear of darkness in the pre-electric world was not irrational in the way that the modern condescending reading of it implies. Modern readers encountering pre-electric sources, the diaries, the letters, the sermons, the medical texts that describe darkness as dangerous, malevolent, threatening, sometimes interpret this as evidence of primitive credulity, of people who did not understand what they were afraid of. This reading has it exactly backwards. The people of the pre-electric world were afraid of the dark because the dark was, in specific and measurable ways, dangerous. The crime rates that spiked after dark, the fire accidents that clustered around nighttime lamp and candle use, the falls and injuries that occurred on unlit roads, the animal predation that was more likely when you could not see and be seen. These were real risks, calibrated to a real environment. The cultural elaboration of darkness as a moral and supernatural category, the demons, the miasmas, the night air, the corrupting influence of the dark hours, built on top of a foundation of genuine risk. The superstition was excessive, the fear was not. The pre-electric world ended, for most people in industrialized countries, within living memory of the oldest people alive, when electric light became widespread. The grandparents of people born in the early 20th century had grown up, in most cases, in houses lit by candles and oil lamps, in cities with gas-lit streets at best, in a relationship with nighttime darkness that their grandchildren would never experience. The pace of the transition varied enormously. Urban and wealthy populations got electric light decades before rural and poor populations. Some communities in remote areas of Europe and North America did not get reliable electric grid connections until the 1940s or 1950s. The darkness did not end everywhere at once. It ended unevenly, the way everything ends in the actual world. What ended with it, besides the darkness, was a specific set of skills, occupations, knowledge systems, and cultural frameworks organized around the management of the dark. The tallow chandler and the wax chandler, the link boy and the night watchman, the almanac publisher and the lantern trimmer. These were real occupations that vanished within a generation, as completely as the darkness they had managed. The folk knowledge about Will, the Wisp, and the lunar calendar and the best route through the city on a moonless night was no longer transmitted because it was no longer needed. The architectural logic of the half-centered room, the bed, curtain, the bed warmer, the fire management ritual, all of this was made irrelevant by a technology that provided light on demand and made the nightly confrontation with darkness optional rather than inevitable. The transition was swift enough that the people who lived through it could feel its completeness as an event rather than a gradual erosion. The woman who had spent her childhood trimming wicks and reading by rushlight could, in her old age, flip a switch. She knew what that switch had replaced. She knew the precise weight of the skill it made obsolete because she had once possessed it. Her grandchildren flipping the same switch knew only that it worked. The knowledge gap between those two generations, the grandmother, who knew what came before, and the grandchild who only knew after, is the gap across which all pre-electric history must be transmitted to a population that has no living memory of what it was like to wait for dawn. The last of the link boys, the child labourers who carried torches through pre-electric city streets to guide wealthy pedestrians through the dark, were still working in some London neighbourhoods when gaslight first appeared on Pall Mall in 1807. The industry did not collapse immediately. Gaslight spread unevenly, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, decade by decade, and in the unlit areas the link, boys remained employed until the light infrastructure reached them. The last generation of link. Boys would have been born into a trade that their parents and grandparents had practiced, not knowing, because no one could know, that they were entering an occupation in its final years. They grew up learning to navigate city streets by torchlight, developed the physical confidence of people who work at night, acquired the occupational habits and professional knowledge of their guild, and then watched the lights come on. Some of them found other work. The trade ended. The same story played out across every pre-electric occupation, organised around the management of darkness. The last professional night watchman of a certain neighbourhood did not know, when he took the position, that he would be the last. The almanac printer in 1880 was still selling copies. The almanac printer in 1920 was not, because the combination of electric light, the newspaper, and the railway timetable had made the specific package of practical knowledge. The almanac sold both freely available and mostly unnecessary. The demand evaporated because the problem the demand addressed had been solved. This is the standard story of technological obsolescence, which we tell neutrally when it applies to industries we do not like, and with regret when it applies to industries we romanticize. The link. Boy deserves the regret version. He was doing difficult, useful work in difficult conditions, and the conditions changed. There is a photograph, taken in the 1890s, of a street in a mid-sized American city on the evening that electric arc lights were first switched on along the main commercial district. The people in the photograph are standing in the street, looking up, not at the lights themselves. The long exposure has blown those out into white halos, but at what the lights revealed, the facades of buildings that had been known for decades, but never seen at night like this, the faces of people standing across the street who would previously have been invisible shapes, the texture of the paving stones, the detail of the shop signs. They are looking at the world that had always been there, now visible in the dark for the first time. The expressions on their faces in the limited resolution of 1890s photography are not clearly legible, but they are looking up. That is legible. The pre-electric world was not worse than the modern world in every respect. The night sky it offered, unpolluted by the wash of ground, level light that now bleaches out all but the brightest stars in any city or suburb, was, by any aesthetic measure, incomparably more magnificent than what is visible from most inhabited places today. The Milky Way, which is now invisible to roughly 1/3 of the human population due to light pollution, was a nightly presence in pre-electric skies. A dense, textured band of light arching across the full sky, detailed enough that different cultures on different continents independently developed myths to explain its specific structure. The people who feared the pre-electric night were also every clear night, sleeping under a sky that no one living in a modern city has ever seen. This was not consolation enough for the crime and the fire risk and the broken ankles in roadside ditches. But it was something. It was on the evidence of everyone who has seen a truly dark sky, a great deal more than nothing. The specific occupational hazard of falling asleep on watch. The night watchman, the fire watchman, the ship's lookout, the sentry was documented, prosecuted, and punished across the pre-electric world with a severity that reflected how much depended on a single pair of eyes, staying open in the dark. A city watchman who fell asleep on his rounds, during which time a fire started or a break-in occurred, was liable for whatever damage resulted. A naval lookout who slept on watch during which the ship ran aground could face court-martial. The harshness of these penalties reflected the real cost of failure in a world with no redundant systems, no alarms, no automated sensors. The watchman's open eyes were the only early warning available. When they closed, the warning system closed with them. The dread of falling asleep on watch, the specific anxiety of the person who knows that staying awake is all that stands between the protected and the danger, is a specific feature of the pre-electric world's relationship with the night that the modern world, with its electronic monitoring and automatic alerts, has made largely obsolete. You do not have to stay awake anymore. The machine stays awake for you. This is, on balance, an improvement. That was just the darkness itself. Wait until you hear about the specific medieval physicians who wrote entire treatises on the correct treatment for nighttime fever. The category of illness they called nocturnal aggravation, in which the patient was fine during the day and deteriorated after dark. A pattern they attributed to the malign qualities of night air entering through pores that opened as the body cooled, and which actually reflected the circadian rhythms of the immune system and the temperature-dependent behavior of bacterial infections that we understand now. but which, in the 14th century, confirmed everything that had always been suspected about what the night was doing to you.